Welcome everyone, and thank you for staying for my talk. Australia is a beautiful country that's just next door, somewhere, I don't know, northwest, east, west, I don't know. Just next door to New Zealand, and here we have some black swans at a local beach. It's a photo I took whilst walking along the beach. Swans are normally in fresh water, but today they were at the beach and it was just beautiful. And they're beautiful just like the colleagues who've been working with me on the Victorian gambling study, Prevalence paper. And this talk really should be entitled, How do I compare studies over time and place when so many methodologies have been used? And what can the Victorian study contribute? Now, right arrow. It works. You can read it? Okay. So what I'm going to do is, why do we want to compare studies and what's the issue? What analysis did we do to help compare studies? What did the analysis show and what were the key findings? So what do they mean? Let me start with the Victorian gambling study. I don't know how many of you went to Rose's talk earlier. If you didn't, I'll just go through this quickly. The Victorian gambling study, the first year of the Victorian longitudinal gambling study was a caddy survey of 15,000 adults 18 plus in 2008. The study was described to participants as a study on an important health and wellbeing issue to Victorian communities. We collected a representative sample of Victorians, and I've got to describe to you a bit about Australia and Victoria, and I'll do it this way. This is Australia, here is Victoria. It's a small area, but it's a highly populous area. It's one of the most populous states in Australia. This is a blow-up of the Victorian area, and here we have 5 rural regions and we have 3 metropolitan regions. And within those regions we've got local government areas. And so that we could enrich for problem gamblers, because problem gambling is a rare event, what we did is we oversampled from local government areas with high EGM spends. So we sampled in the ratio of 70% high spend, 20% low spend, 20% medium spend, 10% low spend. Our problem gambling measures, we used the PGSI past year, and we also used the lifetime measure, the NODS clip. The survey also captured gambling activities and frequency, gambling behaviours, demographics, physical and mental health, environmental and social factors, and help-seeking behaviours. Come on. Okay. Oh. That was the problem they had this morning. Like many countries, what's the context in Victoria? Like many countries, starting in the early 90s when EGMs were introduced, gambling expenditure went up markedly. I've only shown gaming machine expenditure, but gambling expenditure went up markedly. 2 years later, we got our temporary casino, and 2 years after that, we got our permanent casino, and we still only have 1 casino in Victoria. Gambling expenditure reached a peak 2001, 2002, dropped a little bit when we brought in smoking bans into the venues, but it's really levelled out. So it's very similar to other countries that we've seen. Okay, first of all, when I've been writing up the sort of final overall report of the Victorian longitudinal gambling study, and I thought, look, I'll look back over previous studies from the early 1990s which were trying to track gambling participation, and it's, as you can see, it's all a bit jaggedy, but not too bad, and maybe, it's dropped to 73% of the population are gamblers. But each of the studies counted slightly different gambling activities. And then I got to prevalence. Well, in 1997 was the first year that we started measuring the prevalence of problem gambling, and we used SOGs. And as you know, in 2008, if you remember what I told you, we used the PGSI. Excel was really happy to draw a line through this reported prevalence and show a trend. I'm not sure that I would agree with Excel. So really, what that says to me is, how the heck do I compare prevalences when so many different methodologies have been used? Well, luckily, I'm not the first person to ask this question, and some people far better than me have started to work on this. And let me refer you to, if you haven't looked at it, this publication that's freely available on the web. The population prevalence of problem gambling, and in the small print it says, methodological influences, standardised race, jurisdictional differences and worldwide trends. And it's a fantastic publication. And the sort of thing that they've done in there is if you look at the table, let me see if I can do this. You can say, here are different PGSI or CPGI cutoff points, and how do I convert them to, say an 8+ to a 3+. I multiply my results by 3.758. It's really convenient when you're sitting down trying to compare your studies across time and place. What was even more useful is that it broke it up into different issues that might affect the prevalence, but really methodological issues, not really different cultural prevalences. The first thing was the instrument and scoring threshold used to assess problem gambler. So whether people used a SOGS, whether they used a NODS, whether they used a PGSI, and what effect it has. The second thing that they used was, they looked at was the time frame, whether people talked about past year or whether they talked about lifetime. And some of the Victorian studies even said, considering the last 6 months, what do you think about your behaviour? So, what effect does that have on the prevalence? The method of survey administration is important, and some studies have used face-to-face interviews. The New Zealand study, the current one, has used face-to-face interviews. We use telephone interviews. Some people use internet and self-administered surveys. So there's a number of different ways, and they will give you different prevalence rates. How the survey is described to the potential participants, and so whether it's described as a gambling survey, a recreational survey, or a health and wellbeing survey, and that can affect the prevalence. The last one they identified was the threshold used to administer questions about problem gambling. We administered our screen to all gamblers, but some studies have only administered a screen to regular gamblers. What's a regular gambler? What's a frequent gambler? Some people have defined weekly gamblers as regular gamblers. Some people have defined fortnightly gamblers. This is an average over a year. Some have described monthly gamblers. And again, this will affect the prevalence rate that you get. For us, I'd like to include 2 more issues. One is the timing of the survey. In Victoria, spring. Spring is so lovely. It's the time of our football grand finals. Lots of talking about will they win, will they not? And our spring racing carnival, and many of you, non-Australians, will know about the Melbourne Cup. It's internationally known. And so over that time, there's a lot of advertising, a lot of hype, lots of sweeps at work. You know, you've got to bet on the Melbourne Cup, you know. So that's an important issue for us and will have an effect on recall bias. And as Rosa said earlier, we had non-gamblers who, when we asked them specifically whether they'd bet on the grand final or they'd bet on the Melbourne Cup, they actually had. So, you know, there's a small number of people who don't see that as gambling. The last one I want to include is activities included to define the gambler, and as I said earlier, that will affect your gambling participation rate, and different studies collect different gambling issues. Okay, so today I'm just going to go through some of the preliminary data, some of the exploratory analysis, and look at, you know, what happens with participation rate if we exclude a high frequency activity or a low frequency activity, but it is the type of activity that becomes important. Two, let's look at the prevalence of the different PGSI risk segments if we define regular gamblers differently. And the third thing is, let's look at the relationship between the different PGSI risk segments. So for every one problem gambler, how many medium risk gamblers, how many low risk gamblers are there? First of all, in our study, we reported that there were 73% of Victorians gambled. 27% did not. If you look at raffles and sweeps, not far down, where are they? Where's my arrow? There we go. 43%. If you look at speculative stock investments, we're down to about 3%. And you can probably guess, if I exclude one or the other of those, the impact on the participation rate and which one will affect the participation rate. Okay, it's no surprise. This slide will be no surprise to you. We've got 73% of Victorians are gamblers. If I exclude speculative stock investments, it's not that common. It'll only drop down to, hardly drops down at all. But if I exclude raffles and sweeps, it drops down to 64% participation rate, and now 36% of Victorians are non-gamblers. Okay? And that will make it comparable to some of the other studies, because some studies don't capture raffles and sweeps, or they capture it but they don't follow it up with screening. So that's fine. An issue will be whether we've lost any problem gamblers. This is a complex table, and we'll look at it quickly and I'll move you on. What we've got is, I pressed the wrong button. Okay. What we've got is our gambling segments down here, and then what we've got across here are, these are our zero gamblers, and 27% of the Victorian population are zero gamblers, and they're also non-gamblers. If we look at this column, this is the percentage of the different segments that gambled less than monthly. This is monthly to fortnightly, fortnightly to weekly, weekly and more. And this is our full population, or these are the results that we got when we reported our study. So our prevalence is 0.7%, but remember, it's got a confidence interval of 0.55 to 0.9. And you can see that a large part of our problem gamblers are in the weekly gamblers frequency group. Okay. I'll go on to the next slide. This shows it graphically. Some people I work with like graphs, some people like numbers. And we have a look here, these are our different gambling segments. The navy is weekly gambling. So 3/4 of our gamblers, if you believe the PGSI is the gold standard, that's another debate. And we're not got false positives and false negatives. 75% of our problem gamblers are captured as weekly gamblers. If we define regular gamblers as weekly gamblers, we will lose somewhere around 50% of our low risk and moderate risk gambling group. And it depends on what you want to find out from your study, whether you think that's important or not. Now, that's not the full story. To be able to recreate a study which defined regular gamblers as weekly, the assumption will be the non-regular gamblers are non-problem gamblers. So it means that you have to change your data set around and recreate the conditions that only your weekly gamblers will be allocated a PGSI score higher than a non-problem gambler. Okay, so this table was similar to the one before, but now I'm reporting what would be the prevalence rate of the different PGSI segments depending on how I define a regular gambler. And I'm comparing it at the end, the last column is if you screen every gambler. And what we see here is, you know, your eyes are going everywhere, I know. Here we see with the problem gamblers, you can see that the prevalence of problem gambling gradually increases, which is what you'd expect. The differences aren't significant, but there is a suggestion of a trend. It's not significant, and maybe it doesn't matter, but there is a suggestion of a trend. And here you see these values that are bolded. Can you see that they're bolded? Are you? Yeah. Okay. They're significantly lower than the rate we got screening everybody. And then there's a corresponding increase in our non-problem gamblers. They're significantly higher than the value here. And that's created, you know, by who we screen. Go cross-eyed, doesn't matter. This is what it looks like if I exclude raffles and sweeps, and then I recode all my data. And now that I've taken out raffles and sweeps, that's quite frequent, so some of my people have moved down to a lower frequency of gambling because I've excluded the raffle and sweepers. And what we see is a similar pattern, but the major effect of doing that is I've increased my non-gamblers at the expense of my non-problem gamblers. So I can't put them side by side because it's too complex. But that's in effect is what's happened. And that table's similar to before. And this table again shows you the prevalence of, if I define my gamblers as regular gamblers as weekly, fortnightly, monthly, and having excluded raffles and sweeps. And again, you see the same pattern. I don't think I've lost any of my problem gamblers here. We're still seeing this trend, but it's not significant. We're underestimating our low risk and moderate risk gamblers. And you can see this was 27% before, and now it's 36%. I can't remember what this number is, but it's gone down. So, in summary, this, you know, of those tables, what we're seeing here is, this is just another way of demonstrating. If we just look at the top table, don't bother looking at both. You know, 3/4 of our problem gamblers are in the weekly gambling segment, gradually increasing if we assume this is 100%. These are underestimated and these are overestimated by that amount. And knowing that, you can convert across studies. The last bit of comparison is to have a look at, for every one problem gambler, how many moderate risk gamblers have I got? So that if I define regular gamblers as weekly, for every one gambler, there's 2.4 moderate risk, if a gambler can be 0.4. 5 low-risk gamblers, 126 non-problem gamblers and 50 non-gamblers. And sometimes it's helpful to know that comparison. It's really, what's really useful is to be able to convert problem gamblers to the combined moderate and problem risk gamblers, because some studies have combined them because of small numbers. So, you know, that's part of the issue. Or, as has been recommended, some people, problem gamblers are 8+, moderate and problem gamblers are 3+, but Rob's recommending we should use 5+. So, you know, that would take another little bit of analysis, and I could sort of convert studies between, you know, 5+ being the definition. So you can see as we change the frequency of what we call a regular gambler, our ratios change. And I can add in a conversion factor for each of these types of studies so that we can convert from problem gamblers to the combined moderate and problem gambler. And if I do it with my second set of analysis with raffles and sweeps, it gives you a fairly similar result. So, what are the key? Okay, perfect. Key points are, not surprisingly, participation rates are affected by the exclusion of a high prevalence gambling activity, but not speculative stock investments. So we dropped from 73 to, I think it was 64, not 63. The question will be, have we lost some problem gamblers in doing that? The second point is the prevalence of the gambling risk segments affected by how we define our regular gambler, you know, by the frequency of gambler? And if I just take the example of weekly gamblers, which I've taken you through most of this talk, looking at the weekly, the weekly gamblers captures 76% problem gamblers and about half of the moderate risk or the low risk, and overestimates the non-problem gamblers. The effect of excluding an activity like raffles and sweeps, which a lot of people say is not connected to problem gambling, they're probably right, because in this study all we did is increase our non-gamblers and decrease our non-problem gamblers, and really had little effect on our problem gambling segments. The last piece of analysis was to look at the relationship between the segments so that we can convert if people use a broader definition of gambler or a narrower definition of gambler in the PGSI scoring rate. And we can work out a conversion factor, and what I've done is I've put the Williams, Bohlberg and Stevens conversion factor there, and that's probably about right, because, you know, some studies have defined them as monthly, some as weekly, some as any, and, you know, the average figure they got internationally is sitting there, and that sort of reinforces the figures I've got. I played around with some other conversion factors, but I won't talk about them because I did them at the last minute, and I want to have a rethink about those last little bits, because we can convert from weekly to weekly and across there, but then we need to think about taking that conversion factor across to converting, you know, a weekly problem gambler to a, you know, any gambling, yes. Anyway, there are some other complex thought experiments in there. I don't know why I put the question mark there. The exploratory analysis of Victorian gambling study can help to compare studies over time and place. There's no question about it. And it's useful, and I think, you know, that a few of the longitudinal studies, we can do this and provide a stronger case for how we compare studies. And studies such as this take a huge amount of brain power and effort, and so I'd like to acknowledge our colleagues who have contributed in various ways very generously. So, thank you.